There's been some new information about who tips the best when it comes to rideshare drivers. Who tips their drivers the most? This is a really interesting article. And before I show you it, think or ask yourself, who do you think is the best tippers? Is it people in the morning, the night? What type of people do you think tip the best when it comes to their Uber driver and Lyft driver? You could see right away that the Lyft CEO reveals the rideshare's best tippers are Swifties. I'm not gonna lie, if you gave me like a bunch of guesses, I feel like my first ones would be like maybe like people going to the bar, like they're drunk, maybe people who are, I don't know, super rich, right? Swifties, gotta give them a shout out because hey, they're in a pretty good mood and they're more generous. So going down here, the tipping culture right now is a bit tricky, and I will talk about that a bit later in this video, right? But as you can see right here, that consumers may be fed up with tipping, but there's a few unlikely exceptions to the trend in the rideshare industry. If you're going to or from a Taylor Swift concert, so it goes both ways, you are much more likely to be a good tipper, which is really interesting. Actually, I feel like it makes some sense for maybe like people going to a concert. I feel like maybe though when it comes to Swifties, maybe they're obviously so excited. They finally got Taylor Swift tickets, which are super difficult to get. So you're already in a good mood. Both going to the concert, you're like, oh my God, I cannot believe I'm seeing her live. And then coming back from the concert when you're like, I can't believe I just saw her live, right? So in both directions. Another interesting one, so there's two that he really kind of highlights here, which is really interesting, is he saw similar behaviors, I'm gonna go right here, from ice cream lovers. That's another one that I would have not, the two biggest Swifties and ice cream lovers, again, if you gave me 100 guesses, definitely would have not even thought of either of those. But he said that Lyft passengers, and I feel like this probably goes for Uber as well, even though this is mainly talking about Lyft, I feel like the consumer behaviors for both Uber and Lyft are pretty much the same now, I feel like. And he said that Lyft passengers on their way to an ice cream shop typically tipped 20 to 30% more than average, and those leaving tipped as much as 50% higher than average. He argued happy people are just less likely to skimp on tips. And I feel like that makes a lot of sense, but it is interesting, those two things in particular, because I feel like if I'm, let's say, coming back from, I don't know, I'm trying to think like a big moment, like a graduation, like say just graduated college, and I'm ordering a Lyft. Well, then again, I'm in college, so I'm probably broke. But, you know, like I feel like people in graduations maybe would tip more. I don't know. But it is interesting. It makes sense that people's behaviors are typically quite dependent on the mood that they're in. And if they're singing a Taylor Swift song, I guarantee you they're in a pretty good mood and they're more generous with their driver. And it makes sense, I think also too, when you look at, I think maybe a big hidden variable is, you know, what happened with the Taylor Swift tour. I think it said right here that the tour itself, I think it was something like, it was the highest grossing tour, I think, of all time for any musician, something over like $1 billion of money it brought in. And that, of course, includes ride shares to get to and from the concert and everything, right? So going down here, here's the big thing, though. I think now that we're talking about tipping, which is, of course, a very, I think, tricky thing right now in this day and age, the biggest thing is it still doesn't solve the service industry's pervasive tip fatigue issue. Only about 28% of trips on apps like Uber and Lyft yield tips for drivers. Only 28%, right? And I've talked about this in a few videos. I think what's kind of annoying I've seen, and I'll talk about this in my recap at the end of this video, is one, I think tipping culture, I think everyone agrees, almost everyone, has gotten a bit ridiculous. And we'll talk about that a bit later. But two, I think on top of that, which is kind of annoying, is I think out of any industry that I've ever seen, ever been a part of, ever witnessed, if that's the right word, I think ride sharing is the industry that deserves tips when they don't get any tips, if that makes sense. I feel like the ride sharing conglomerate and ride share drivers in general get tipped the least amount out of any industry when they should be getting tips, right? Going down here, that means that tips account for 10% of a driver's earnings compared to grocery and food delivery app workers who make almost about half, 51% of their earnings from tips. I mean, you're looking at the Gridwise CEO. Gridwise does a lot of studies and research and surveys about ride sharing. There's one quote from the CEO that said, "We saw some of the high fares when it's more than $1,000 but zero tip." And that's for 6 hours of driving, right? And as we know, low and no tips had real impact on drivers who organized strikes across the country earlier this year, demanding higher pay and fewer fees that sapped chunks from their fares, right? Not only are rideshare drivers, like I've talked about in a bajillion videos, getting paid less, they're getting a higher cut out of their pay. Expenses are going up because of inflation. Yet on top of all this, you're talking about not getting tips when they should be getting tips, right? And this is where things get really annoying, which is what I'm going to touch upon in a second. And that is this. Consumers don't feel much motivation to open their wallets. The USA Today's Blueprint team and one poll found that 2023 surveys found that 63% of respondents believed too many businesses were asking for tips, with about 80% of Gen Z saying they felt more pressure to tip. Most believed, and I think this is a big issue right now, and this kind of unfortunately affects ride sharing, most believed tipping had become too expensive or felt it wasn't their responsibility to tip. Rather, that it was the job of the business to pay workers fairly. There's a lot to unpack here. One, starting maybe with the more interesting, or I guess upbeat part of the article, the two big ones, Swifties and people getting ice cream, the biggest ones to tip. So let's say you're driving and you know there's a Taylor Swift concert happening in your area. You got to do whatever you can to make sure you drive, right? Bigger tips overall. And of course, the surge prices surging is going to be crazy. Second thing, which I feel like is not as easy to determine, right? Just given the way the app works. But I guess going to the ice cream, if let's say you happen to pick somebody up at the ice cream shop, hopefully they're in a good mood, which based off these statistics they are, and you can get, statistically speaking, a higher tip. Kind of interesting that those two, again, like I said, if you gave me 100 guesses, those two would have not made my 100, not in a bad way, but I would have not have thought of it, you know? But hey, shout out to these Swifties and shout out to the ice cream lovers, the best tippers. But this brings up, I think, a very tricky conversation around tipping. And I know right now it's a huge hot topic. I think if you like it for better or for worse, typically for worse right now. And it's unfortunate that ride sharing, I think, just inevitably, with everything going on with tipping and tipping culture, is being brought into this limelight. I don't say in a negative way, but kind of. And here's what I mean. I remember when I was younger, going to a restaurant, the average, I grew up in the 90s. I remember the average tip was 15%. That's what you always did. So let's say if your bill was $100, you tipped $15. Always 15%. If your service was like mind-blowing or really, really good, then 20%. And then I think as I got older, I remember 20% started to become a little bit more common. I also think, I know it sounds weird, that a big part of the 20% is it's easier to do the math out, right? If you do 15% of, let's say, a given amount in your head, it's kind of tricky. But 20%, you just double it, move the decimal place over, right? So 20%, I think, especially because back in the day, you didn't have a calculator in your pocket. Now we all do. It was a bit easier, I think, mathematically as well. And then I would say after I bartended, 20% was kind of my standard, right? Any single time I was going out, I always tip 20%, unless I'm going to, let's say, a bar and I order a beer, which in case you didn't know, the kind of rule of thumb now, although you could argue it, which brings up some other topics, it's typically $1 per beer. So if I order a $7 beer, typically the tip should be $1.40. But for most bartenders and most bars, $1 is pretty much the standard if you just open up a beer and that's it, right? And then things got kind of ridiculous, as we all know. Not only, I think, in percentages, but where you tip. So two different things. And this is very important when it comes to ride sharing and tipping, I think. One, the percentages got higher. Like I said, when I was younger, 15% was kind of the standard. And then 20% was like wow, you got amazing service. Now, it seems like 20% is the standard, and now it's even going further than that, right? And we've all probably been there where kind of like there's so many memes about this now, there's a bajillion memes where you go to order something, you're at a restaurant, something happens, you go to order, and the person says, oh, we're just going to ask you a few questions, which I feel like that has the same energy as someone saying like, hey, do you want to come over and Netflix and chill? Like, we know what Netflix and chill really means. We know what, oh, it's just going to ask you a few questions really means. And when they flip that tablet around, as opposed to it being, which I feel like should make sense, like 15%, 20%, maybe 22%, I've gone to places now where it starts at 25. There's 25%, 28%, 30%. Or I've even seen some that start at like, say, 28 and go 28, 30, 33. And it's like, wait a minute, they're suggesting that. Of course, you can always hit no tip or custom tip. But one, the percentage of how much you're tipping is way higher now than ever before. And I know this seems like a bit of ranting about tipping culture, but it is very important when it comes to ride sharing. The second thing is where you tip. I use this example a couple times in some videos that I went to a concert here in LA, might as well just say. It was Sound Nightclub. It was a nightlife venue for DJs, electronic music. It was a show. And when I paid, it was like a $5 cover, pretty cheap. they asked me to tip. And if it was going to, like, say, the DJs, I don't mind supporting live music, but I'm like, is it going to, like, the person at the door? Is it going to the bouncer? Like, I don't know where this money is going towards. And it was weird that I'm asking to tip on top of a ticket that I'm buying. Like, I just bought a ticket and they're asking me to tip. Kind of weird. And I do know that maybe to an extent, it's just a programming thing that's in these tablets that they just ask it regardless of what you're buying. But as we all know, it has gotten ridiculous. The reason why I say all that is preempting it, connecting with ride sharing. I think it's unfortunate. And like I said, out of any industry right now, rideshare drivers, I think, deserve tips just as much as waiters, waitresses, bartenders, the list goes on, and yet don't. As you saw from the research I just showed you, it seems like only about a quarter of rides the person actually tips. That is really, really unfortunate. And then you combine all of this with the fact that rideshare drivers are getting paid way less than before. Like I said before, it's the triple threat, like I mentioned. Rideshare drivers get paid way less than before. And in addition, Uber and Lyft taking out a bigger cut than ever before, which I have an interesting story about this. And then 3, lastly, things are more expensive. Gas is more expensive. Maintenance on your car is more expensive. The list goes on and on. And I think it's unfortunate because I took an Uber a couple days ago, and what's kind of interesting is the driver recognized me. He goes, do you do YouTube? And I'm like, yeah, and I'm going to keep this anonymous. But he's like, hey, you do YouTube, right? And I'm like, yeah. He's like, oh, I watch a bunch of your videos. I like your videos. And we were talking about the pros and the cons, mostly the cons, I think, of driving for Uber and Lyft. And it got to the point where we felt comfortable enough where we're talking about how much Uber and Lyft's taking out a bigger cut. And I'm like, well, let me ask you, if you know me asking, now that we're talking about this, you've watched my videos, we paid, I'm rounding up a little bit, it was like $21 and change. So basically $22 for this ride. How much is Lyft, or in this case, it's going to be Uber, how much is Uber paying you for this ride? And he's like $7, I think it's like $6.80. He was getting paid a third of what we were paying. That is insane. And that just shows how ridiculous it's gotten, that we were paying about $22, he was getting paid about $7. I feel like back in the day, even years ago, for that same ride, I'd probably spend $16, the driver would probably get $10, right? I'd be paying less, the driver getting paid more. Now it's the opposite. I'm paying more money for the driver to get less money. Not the way it should be. And then when you look at all these different factors, the fact that drivers are not getting tipped, I think I think it's something that I think has gotten better. And I have mentioned this, that back in the day when Uber and Lyft first came out, the biggest thing for them is they want it to be a cashless transaction. They don't really argue this anymore. But back in the day, that was kind of the big selling point, I think, is, and I do get it, that it can be a little bit, for lack of a better word, awkward. If, let's say, I'm in a taxi, and when the taxi gets here, I'm like, okay, do I have cash? Do I pay with card? Do I tip? Like, all these kind of weird things happen. And still, I think a lot of people forget that one of the unique aspects of Lyft and Uber, among a lot of them, is that all the kind of cash transaction, financial stuff happens behind the scenes. It's almost like it's hidden, like you don't even see it going down, right? And so that's a big thing for Uber and Lyft in the beginning, and as a result of that, you were not supposed to tip. Uber and Lyft was very aggressive to say, look, you don't accept tips. No one tips. Now, that whole kind of methodology has gone away. So I feel like that's not really an argument anymore, although I might as well mention it on this video, considering we're talking about tipping. I think the big issue now is, one, I think if you ask somebody, or ask the general public, should rideshare drivers get tips? I think most people would say yes. Look, they're in the service industry. They're not getting paid the way they should be paid. And yes, I do understand, I think, a good amount of Gen Z's argument saying, well, why should we cover their wage when, they should be getting paid fairly? And to an extent, I kind of agree. I think rideshare drivers should both get paid the way they should be getting paid and also get tips. I think it's a combination of both, right? But it's unfortunate. I think it's really the only industry that I've seen where it's almost this odd paradox where I think most people would agree drivers should get paid, while on the other end, drivers are getting paid way less than any other industry. And I think the biggest thing is honestly the lack of social pressure. I genuinely think that's it, right? Like, if you go to a restaurant and you don't tip, if you go to a bar and you don't tip, you probably get called out, right? I mean, we all know this. I remember one time, for example, this happened last year. I went out and it was a friend visiting from Europe. They were only here for 1 week. They don't really understand American customs. Their English is kind of spotty, right? We went to a bar. I got the first round. I tipped, like I always do, right? We're at a bar. She got the second round. And when she did, when the tip came, she goes, and and she put 0, crossed it out, basically saying no tip. Hand it back to the bartender, and I remember like the look that he had with us. He was like he was livid. And then every single time we went up to the bar, even though I was getting, let's say some of the rounds, or I would get the drinks after that, he avoided us at all costs, right? And I think, for lack of better, obviously, I don't think she really understood the way tipping is in America. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't care. I don't know. But I think what's interesting about that, though, is it shows that there is kind of, for lack of better argument, whether you look at it in a good way or a bad way, this social pressure to tip is what I think makes a lot of people tip. Now, for me, whether there's social pressure or not, I'm going to tip. But a lot of people don't think that way. And I think with ride sharing, it is that kind of situation. I think, one, for a lot of people to say, hey, you know what? If I leave the Uber Lyft, no one's even going to slap me on the wrist. No one's going to yell at me. No one's going to call me out in public. And I think for a lot of people, they're just like, whatever, I'm not going to tip because they're like, no one's going to know, like, who cares, right? I also think the second thing is for any restaurant or bar or whatever, for the most part, the transactional thing taking place happens at the same time that you tip, typically. Not always, but typically, right? So if someone, let's say, gives me, a beer, and I give them my credit card, they give me a receipt back where I have to sign, right? You always typically have to do that. You have to sign, but then I also have to tip right there. So it happens all at once where you're like, oh yeah, I'm paying it, but I'm also tipping right now. Same thing with a restaurant and most other establishments. I think with ride sharing, like I touched upon earlier, things happen behind the scenes. That's one of the goals of Lyft and Uber way in the beginning, which I think is a positive thing. I think it removes this kind of awkwardness sometimes of paying. But at the same time, that means, and for a lot of people, and I don't even think people mean to do this purposely, although maybe, is they get done with the Uber and Lyft, they get out, and like say they're going to a bar, they're going to wherever, they get out and they maybe just go off and start doing their thing. I think they forget, like, oh yeah, you should rate your driver, of course. But I think a lot of people think, unless it's a really bad driver, a lot of people just give 5 stars typically. But you get out, you start going off and doing what you're going to be doing, and you forget, oh yeah, I have to tip. It's almost like there's 2 points of the transactional process. The things happen behind the scenes in the beginning. You're like, oh, I know I'm paying. And then you have to remember to pull the app back up and tip. And yes, I think Uber and Lyft has gotten better in terms of their GUI, or the graphical user interface of the app, that when you pull it up after the ride, it does say right away, and I think it's getting a bit more pushy, which I like, hey, what do you want to tip them? Here's the tip options, here's the percentage options, blah, 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 right? So I do think there has been some progress, and I think that tipping with rideshare drivers has gotten more common. Like I said, I think the whole ideology of you don't tip your rideshare driver is dead. If you ask most, I think even Gen Z people, do you remember that? I think they'd say no. They'd be like, wait a minute. Uber and Lyft used to tell people you don't tip your rideshare drivers. Like they used to go out of their way to say don't tip your drivers. I don't think maybe any of them would remember that, which is good. But I think the problem is the tipping logistics. Again, unless you're like a Swiftie, or unless you're someone like say going to an ice cream shop, I might even include, I wonder if like a restaurant would be included in that as maybe like a sub tier, maybe not as big as ice cream, or maybe going to another concert or whatever, like you're in a good mood. And it makes sense. If you're in a good mood, if you're in a positive mood, you're more likely to tip. That makes sense logically. But I will say, I think one huge kind of odd, tricky thing that gets involved in the equation of being a rideshare driver, among the triple threat, like I said, among not getting the money that you should be getting paid, on top of all these other things going on in terms of the logistics, wrongful deactivations, all this kind of stuff I've mentioned in different videos, is tipping. And I do think we've come a long way. I think rideshare driving has gotten a lot better, but the issue is, like I said, with a lot of people being frustrated with tipping, and with an industry like ridesharing, when it comes to your drivers, you have to tip them. It's very important to them. It's annoying that those 2 things are now getting kind of brought together, even though maybe people don't mean to. They're like, oh, you know what? I'm just done with tipping. I'm done with tipping. I'm not going to tip my rideshare driver because it's easier. It's easier to not tip your rideshare driver than to not tip your bartender or your waiter or waitress or whatever, right? And so I think a lot of people who are just fed up with tipping culture also group that with ride sharing, which just kind of sucks, right? Because I think for a lot of other industries, we'd agree. Some industries, and I'm not going to say any names, we could argue this till the cows come home, or however that quote goes. There are some industries where I'm like, look, they don't deserve as much of a tip as they're asking for on that tablet. Maybe they don't deserve a tip at all, where it's like, wait, why am I tipping, like I said, for that concert venue? This doesn't make any sense. But for rideshare drivers, they do deserve tips, and they need them, and it's super important. And as the studies have been showing, I think while maybe things have been getting better, we still have a long way to go for rideshare drivers to get tipped the way they should be getting tipped, as it's super important to continue the overall ridesharing industry.